kernel server as a collaborator, which was maybe an interesting way to think about what is a kernel. Is just a collaborator, like you and me who type on a document, but maybe who is more powerful or which can do more than just typing. It can also execute what you type. Yeah, so this was for the RTC talk. I have opened also an issue just to track, and it's linked also to the question, or do we transfer the kernel messages? I think if we have visuals with like sequence diagram with actor, which is a client, server, and so on, well, I hope we can at least have a better material to discuss about those flows. And so it is issue 87. I didn't push yet a lot there, but yeah, I think it can be useful to have a discussion around what we do.
Sounds good. And maybe working on those diagrams, that's something maybe we could do on a call together this week sometime, Eric. I think that would be useful.
Yeah, sure.
And then some of the demo I wanted to show today kind of speaks to the first question that you had about the kernel messages, at least one way we could approach that. And then the second one is about, yeah, the notebook model state, and that's what I had on my docket for the next couple of weeks. I was exploring how to represent that on the server. But there's obviously many ways we could tackle these things. Oops. Zoom now makes me admit everyone one by one. So I guess unless there's discussion, there's things I could show the demo. That's good. Yeah, so previously, I'd just been using this this GraphQL visual debugger thing. I can start it this way on the Jupyter server. So this /GraphQL, this like playground. But this is kind of cumbersome to write a bunch of queries and then get the results back and use them. So I wanted to, and I have some tests that test the queries. So I thought it might be nice to be able to do this in a notebook to kind of explore some test cases. So this is kind of cool because it's actually using the Jupyter Server PyTest fixtures, and it's pulling those in to start a server here. And then once we have a server started, we can run GraphQL queries against it. So in this case, it's running this query or this mutation called start kernel, and it's grabbing off the kernel ID. So then we can like look at the kernel ID. So this is the ID that Jupyter Server assigns to the kernel. And then in GraphQL, you usually have UUIDs that are globally unique. So we just prefix it with kernel to show the type of resource. So now we can, like, for example, get a list of the kernels and see their execution state. We see we have a kernel that's idle. Another thing that's kind of nice here is we can run subscriptions, which are like over WebSockets, and they get up that you listen for changes. So here I can listen for this kernel ID when the execution state changes. And then, so this is running. And then if I restart the kernel, I see that we get these messages. It was restarting, it was starting, it was busy, and now it's idle again. So this is kind of a nice way to like test what we're doing and make sure that it's reasonable. I guess we see some of the standard out too gets fed in here. But anyway, the point was to try to do some, I've hooked up some of the listening on some of the channels so that we can actually do some code execution. So I'm going to be executing this cell. Here I'm grabbing, I can actually just grab less of this. But anyway, I'm executing. So here I'm doing a mutation. I'm calling execute is the mutation, and I'm passing in the kernel ID and my code. And then all this is just what I want to fetch right after I run the mutation, which is the current execution and all these fields from it. So the idea is that on the server, we have a list of all the executions that happen, and we save those so that the server is responsible for keeping those up to date with the 0MQ kernel messages, not the clients. So we can run this execution and we see starts out, we don't know the status, there's no displays, there's no input request. We can see the code and the ID. And then we can, after a little bit, we can run the query to get the execution, passing an execution ID, and we can see we get out a display, a standard out display that says 2, and we get out the data, which is the MIME type hello world. So I don't have everything hooked up yet, but let me just pull up the, maybe I'll do it on GitHub. It's easiest. So this is the spec for the execution. So we can see all the things it contains, like the status, the displays, each of the displays, right? Like whether it's data or stream, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I wanted to just kind of spec that out to show how that could work. And then my next to do would be to add the notebook model in memory as well. So then we can say, like Eric was talking about, load this notebook from disk, make an edit on this cell, execute that cell, and then save that notebook back to disk. And that all the state would be held server side for that notebook during that process. Yeah. And then I guess one other thing I saw was this Interact kernel relay project, which seemed pretty similar to what is exploring here with this GraphQL endpoint that has this cache of like your executions and such, and it communicates to the kernels and talks to your different apps. This hasn't had much work on it, it looks like, and it's slightly different scope, but I thought it was kind of interesting that it was a similar approach there. And I guess to kind of zoom back out, how does this relate to RTC? Like, if you move all of the kernel state, like executions, etc., you move all the notebook state to the server, then RTC is doing a lot less. Like it can just be responsible for synchronizing people's edits if they're both editing the same cell, for example, like making sure that there aren't conflicts. And so the scope is much reduced for, like, for example, what we need YJS for. And it also is a way to provide a lot of the functionality of RTC, including like multi-user editing and collaboration, when you don't need maybe the like merging of people editing the same line without pulling in a large JavaScript library like YJS or something. So it kind of provides like a higher foundation to build off of. That's easy to specify in a way that's agnostic to the front end or the back end. Since all that's specified is the GraphQL schema, like you could re-implement this backend in any language or, you know, with any kind of technology. And as long as it can speak the same mutations and queries and such, then you could communicate with it. So that's some of the thinking there about why the, how this could kind of help, like maybe a larger scale, providing like a bedrock, I guess, to build some of the real-time features on top of.
It's an awesome demo, Saul. Thanks for sharing, man. I gotta wrap my brain around that. Is there, so I'm coming like really, really late to the game here. So I'm gonna ask some stupid questions that I wish I had participated 6 months ago to ask, because these are things you've probably thought about way ahead of time. So yeah, apologies if you're like, I've explained this 6 times before.
No, that's perfect.
Is there, have you considered like, and I don't know how hard this would be, because I was trying to like parse out all the like, is there work we can do in parallel with the server, or I mean with the whole RTC idea, like, because I think that inline editing is like actually probably way less useful than people want to argue. I think what they really want to do is open a notebook at the same time and not fear that if they do make changes somewhere in the notebook, they're just going to wipe out their friend's notebook. Could we, is there like, so like documents like Quip or applications document editing like Quip, they just lock, they cheat by just locking the line that you're on. So in Jupyter world, this would be like locking a cell and just saying like, you can edit other parts of this document, but once somebody like clicks on this cell or runs this cell, this thing goes, you can't touch it until it's done executing or they're done editing and they exit that cell. Which to me probably has the it requires less work on the server to synchronize anything and puts more effort on the actual front end. The reason why I'm thinking about that is I can see, so the hard part about doing like this GraphQL stuff is which I think is something really like, we're gonna have to do some major work on the server, because I agree, like we should offload some of the actual hard parts of things like synchronizing kernel messaging that's coming in, especially when multiple people are trying to run cells at the same time. Handling that on the server is gonna be a lot easier. But could we get quick wins without putting ourselves in a hole by doing something on the client? And maybe that's, like I said, locking some interactions for real time, just to get the fact that you just to get the quick win that you can open the document. Two people can open the same document at the same time, and it won't worry about like saving collisions. And then in parallel do this like GraphQL exploration.
I mean, definitely, I think there's a ton of different ways you could do this in different levels of effort, I guess.
But could you do those where you don't collide with each other? Like,
well, I think if you were doing the locking thing, that would be totally independent, right? Because it wouldn't depend on this work at all. It wouldn't depend on any of the CRDT work at all. It would, I assume, be some separate service that you would hit maybe and say, hey, this cell is locked now, this cell isn't locked, something like that, I guess. And the front end would be aware of that.
do you think we need to like replace, like, are we at the end of the day like getting rid of in a perfect world getting rid of Jupyter Server and replacing it with a new server? Or do you think we should keep these as, keep the REST API and the Tornado web server around and have GraphQL side of the server a extension of that?
Well, I think as I'm doing it now, it's kind of agnostic to that question. Like,
cool.
Right now it's running obviously next to the existing REST server and
yeah,
using the existing managers, so that like if you, for example, start a kernel with the REST server and you hit the GraphQL server, you'll see that the kernel is there, right? So I feel like that's more of an ecosystem question of like who's using which parts, and obviously at this point everyone is using REST, so it wouldn't make sense to get rid of it. Like, right, so it's more of like a, I don't know, longer term timeline thing. And I think, yeah, it can work either way. I guess the nice part is it gives us the option to, if, you know, kind of like a gradual move, if people do move to this and depend on it, then you can see a way to easily fade out the REST server without breaking things for clients who have moved, but you don't need to do it all at once. So it's not like a hard break or anything like that. Those are good questions, by the way. They're not, you don't need to talk down your questions.
From Zach question, there may be like already 3 ways to implement RTC. There may be like the lock and lock, which is a very base one, I mean. Then there would be like the GraphQL you showed us, which does not even need CRDT, YGS, and so on. And then there would be like the third one, which would be like the one we've done last year with CRDT. And you can expand and have combination of both or of multiple ones. And these are probably all valid ways to implement and to deliver something. All 3 are, maybe you can think more with the 4th one and so on. Yeah, but we have limited resource. So I just mean, do you want to, we can think about that, but do we want to take a decision on one of them, or do we want to continue exploring all of them?
Well, I think we have limited resources, but all our resources are sort of independent somewhat. So I guess we can coordinate, but I guess we all have different timelines, I think, probably on what we're delivering and for who. So I think that might impact what makes the most sense for different people to work on. Like, I don't know what your, like, yeah, what your timeline is like, or what, how much that impacts things. But
also the feature we deliver with those options are different. For example, you don't have undo redo with some of them. And if you want undo redo, maybe you want the RTT, I don't know. So it's not only about resource, it's also about the feature we deliver. But maybe it's good enough to just to lock, and so it's already something we we can at least show. But I feel like the server side is something, but implementing any of those options in Jupyter Lab is a piece of work. It's not minor. Even a lock and lock is some work on Jupyter Lab that we need to know.
So maybe I can, I'm curious maybe to go back a little bit, like pretty far actually. And like, what are some of the like the RTC experiences that we're trying to use as like the state of the art when we're thinking about this interaction and experience? Like HackMD or like VS Code or something like that. Are there any things that we're kind of using as like sort of trademark or like representative ideas?
Yeah, I think the reference was Google Docs, but this is very ambitious.
It is. It is.
I've been trying to talk about it when I was talking, like Tim George and I have talked about it over a long period of time. And what I've learned from Tim George, among many things, is that he always thinks about it in terms of like specific, user stories. Like, how do I, like, what is this thing? What is this pain point that this person is experiencing, and what would be the solution to that? And like, for example, a very simple one is two people are working on a notebook. They just both want to open the document, and they know, like, something as simple as opening a document and maybe one person wanting to add the cell while the other person's looking at it. That doesn't require, like character by character editing. It's just simply, I don't want to accidentally save the document without while someone else is changing it, and then override their changes or whatever.
Well, so go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's one lower level problem than like the full Google Docs character by character editing.
Yeah, I think that's like almost too low level in a sense, right? Like, I'm curious, like maybe even just in this room as a small sample, like what are the best experiences outside of Google Docs, right? Like Google Docs is basically the gold standard for this. But what are some of the tools in our world, right? Because like at our company, a lot of the developers aren't writing prose or code in Google Docs. They're doing it in GitHub. So what's the stuff that's like closer to our world that is a good example here? Like personally, I've never had a bad experience with HackMD. And I'm curious about like how other people might feel about some of the RTC things. And I'm not, personas are hard in Jupyter because there's so many different kinds of users. It's like, what's good already and what are we shooting for?
Totally. That wasn't supposed to be the one and only user story. It was like, let's start collecting just these simple tasks and then see, like, could we draw a circle around, a majority, or at least a majority is not even the right approach. It's like, what is the, I guess, most common? And maybe that's hard to even define too.
Yeah, I mean, like, so HackMD is open source. They have an open source server with their CRDT stuff there. And like, I know we're thinking about notebooks, but I'm like wondering, hey, can we just do this in Markdown to start, right? Like, because if I have Markdown and a console, then I'm not having coding problems, and all I'm worried about is sort of the editing story here. So like, there are a lot of extra complexities when we're dealing with interactive code. But like, can this program like get to some baseline standards and build off of those? Because there are a lot of problems. Like, what are the ones we can reference immediately?
I had a look at the source code of HackMD, the open source one, and I followed back the issues. It is clear that they were using OT, which is operational transformation. And it's not clear if they moved to CRDT. Maybe I could have a second look to that. But there are other open source projects which we could use just to have that simple editor. With YGS, they bind to CodeMirror. You have CodeMirror editor connecting with YGS. So we could start from those. It's fully available. And maybe to continue about, I think we focus a lot on the editor, but to come back to the user stories and user pain points, I see a lot of issues to address in terms of kernel sharing. So you share a document, but do you share also the state, the variables, and so on? So Jupyter Lab is complex because you have that additional parameter or dimension, which is the variables you have in the kernel.
And
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking here is like when I hear about the complexity, there are so many open-ended questions, right? Everybody's going to want to work differently. But like the complex state is a combination of a markdown editor, a code editor, a CodeMirror editor. There are these smaller features. I'm kind of wondering, like, you know, can we, by just starting small and starting with state of the art and getting that like closer to us, like what's the goal? And maybe the goal, maybe a short-term goal is to write stories quicker with other people. So, you know, if it was just simply editing, and then figure out what do people want with the kernel story, right? Like if we had a document in Markdown, could somebody spawn a shared console where both people could be hacking on? Or do people get local consoles? Are there ways to put some trust elements in there? But I'm curious if you can kind of like deconstruct this problem down a little bit more incrementally rather than dealing with all the complexity at once.
Maybe worth noting too, a prior art, I learned this last week. I didn't even know this. Steve told me this, but the prior RTC experience that came out in 2016, I think, maybe it was showed at Jupyter Con.
Is that pre 1.0? Would that be pre 1.0 basically?
That's pre 1.0.
Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
So, but it was you didn't share kernels. It was actually it really was just like real-time editing in the cells, and then anybody was running on their separate kernels. And yeah, like you definitely can get some you know questionable user experience out the other end, but at the same time, like it was, I think people liked it. You know, some people just wanted to edit a document at the same time, and so there are weird like maybe the kernel thing is a later question, because it is a harder, we don't know what the solution is. And it may be that there has to be a bunch of different experiences that come out the other end on that one, but then real-time editing in a cell is a faster solution we can get to address a lot of needs too.
I mean, I think that like, Zach, you and I could probably collaborate on a document that just used a shared binder kernel, for example, right? Like that might be a sandboxed way to think about this originally, perhaps. So maybe you're even switching out kernels at any given time when you run things. Like if you were to select some code and hit Shift Enter, and that sends it over to the console, it's like, oh, what kernel do you want to be on, your local one or the shared one?
I guess the other part of the user experience here is the like Jupyter Hub question, and I guess one of the open points in my mind has always been like, can we run one Jupyter server for many users instead of doing this thing where we spawn separate processes for each user? And so that's, I guess, comes somewhat to like the identity work that's being done and things like that. But that's, for me, the most exciting user experience kind of question is like, how can we really make Jupyter, the server, like more of like a multi-user web application instead of something you just run locally for yourself, and that would allow a lot of interesting like ways to, I don't know, just help with the deployment story a lot and all that kind of stuff. So that's even though this doesn't have anything specifically about identity, I guess that's the other place that we could work independently. Like I know that maybe Zach, maybe that work, I don't know, I haven't been following it that closely, but the permissioning kind of work that you were doing on the Jupyter server, and kind of even just articulating what that vision would look like a little bit more.
Yeah, I don't think that's actually been, like, no one spent time thinking about that on Jupyter specifically yet. Like, I think I did some initial scoping out of some one problem I was trying to solve a while ago, and it hasn't, and it's now been in standstill just because it hasn't been prioritized. But yeah, that's absolutely something we and all the work that Kevin Bates has been doing on remote kernels and thinking about kernels as having multiple users. Like him, the server ain't even the place where he wants multiple users. Kernels is where he wants multiple users. Now the server is, maybe how he's proxying those requests, but in some sense, like, he's just spawning kernels, Jupyter kernels somewhere and connecting to them however he wants. And I think Eric's got the same, interest too. And so trying to figure out how we make those things have, some level of, or abstraction of multi-tenancy would be.
Yeah, you can have that identity on the server or rely on Jupyter Hub and so on. But I would like maybe to lay here a thought. I mean, RTC is complex. The user experience must be delicious. We all want that. But I wonder, or it's a fear or a feeling I have, we need so many building blocks. Identity, we discussed that, but remote kernels and so on. And I don't want, or I hope we can find a way to move without having all those building blocks at the same time. Otherwise, we will never have something, because we just need to find a way to have something with not all the building blocks. And this is something I'm struggling with. I tend to target, well, we need a complete picture. Even if it's not fully operational, a building block is not perfect, but we need that block. But I expect if I continue thinking that way, I will not, or we will not move so much, because it's impossible to have all the building blocks at the same time. So my question is, how can we progress even with the half or not all? Well, we need a minimum, but what is that minimum step? What is the road we need to follow? Which building blocks we need to have on the table to progress? We don't have identity, fine, but we don't have it, but how can we do without it? By the way, how can we?
Yeah, dogfooding these pieces as we go is really helpful too, Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things like I've enjoyed about the GraphQL work is by specifying things explicitly with the types, it feels like even if you're just exposing the same things you're exposing in Jupyter server, like you very cleanly articulate what those are, and you can see how you would then add on other parts later. So there's like a clear path kind of forward for migration and additions and movement, but it gives you a space to put those things where that's different from like the current Jupyter server space, which is harder to type properly, I think, and then also just harder to move because it has so much legacy usage already.
So for my user experience, right, I keep tripping out. Like I was thinking about, Steve messaged me on Twitter and he's like, oh man, we did that Atlanta Jupyter Day thing. It was 4 years ago. I've been using Jupyter Lab since pre 1.0 and deleted my files. It's it's been a growth process. But over the years, the one thing for me that has improved my ability as a scientist and my ability to communicate is moving processes that would happen outside of Jupyter Lab into Jupyter Lab. So if I don't have to go to a separate tab for Jitsi, and I can have Jitsi right in my browser, if I can have my web server right in my browser, if I can have my iframes right in my Jupyter Lab, if I can move away from other services that are doing similar things and put them into Jupyter Lab, I wind up becoming more efficient. So my question is like, what are some features that I would have that like the user would typically have to do outside of Jupyter Lab? What can we bring in immediately and start seeing if that provides productivity enhancements?
I don't know if this is what you mean or not, but I think one of the big current issues is that when you execute a cell and you close your browser, you know, then the results go away. To me, that's one like nice thing that we could solve that the UX is really clear about and would just be a win. And is pretty unambiguous that people want that.
Could I use the GraphQL to actually like just pull out that output, have it like live in a tab somewhere, and when it shows up, it shows up?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's the advantage is you can deal with it more independently, right? You know, it doesn't depend on your browser being open or whatever to be properly updated and things like that.
Yeah, like I when I work on like blog posts and stuff with folks, I use the live share inside of VS Code, and it's pretty good. And I also use the HackMD stuff, and I'm just thinking like folks work together on like JupyterCon presentations for the past couple weeks, and a lot of that is about prose. You know, like if Jupyter notebooks are effective in communicating computational narratives, it's going to be a lot of prose around code. If y'all were to just focus on the prose part, will we be able to write better, more diverse stories if more people can work together just on the prose part? Because I know the code part and the output part is really hard, but I really like the idea of folks telling stories together and what happens in the middle of all of those. GraphQL demo was cool, by the way. If I want completion on that, that would be so cool if you get completion on the GraphQL schemas.
I know, I was thinking about that. I don't know how to make it happen. I guess if you had a separate kernel.
Well, I love the Dungeon Master kernel, the Jupyter Hub kernel that like can talk to all the other Jupyter Hub kernels. At least that's what we call it. We call it the Dungeon Master kernel, like the person who gets to know everything and like narrate the game. But there's an interesting use case on that one as somebody like running potentially like Jupyter Home or Jupyter Hub at home. And being able to communicate with their IoT devices over like RTC or something like that. So, you know, maybe in some way there might not even be a human on the other side of these things. Could RTC be wired up to a bot that's helping you through your day or something?
The other thing I wanted to mention before the end of the call was that this will be my last month at Quantsite, and I'm going to be taking at least a few months off, and Eric is going to be taking over these meetings and over the grant from CZI. So I might be involved again in January, or might not. So yeah, hopefully things will continue on in my absence.
In the absence of any other information, I'll just say good luck with whatever you have planned.
Yeah, I don't really have very many plans. I'm just gonna chill and see what seems like good to focus on. So
Well, maybe one day you can come back and report back to us all what it means to be chill.
yeah, I'll send you updates on how my baths are going.
Thank you, Saul, for all your work on this, man.
Yeah,
Really
legit,
appreciate
it
it.
wouldn't have happened if you didn't do it. Great job, man.
It's been fun. So, but yeah, don't be a stranger. I'm around still, even though I might not come to the meetings and stuff. So feel free to reach out. I'm sure we'll all keep in touch.
Yes, thank you for pushing this, having pushed that. And maybe if you say you're going to join, maybe in 2 weeks we will see you. But just have some chill, as you said. Enjoy your time.
All right. Well, nice to see you all. Hope you have a nice rest of your Monday. I'll post.
Take care, bro.
Cool.
See you
Bye,
all.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.